Shogun is one of the greatest novels ever written. One of the greatest historical fiction books that sold over 15 million copies globally. And now it's being rebooted to a modern age. The novel was originally released in 1975, written by James Clavell. It is part of Clavell's Asian Saga, a series of books that retell true events of often Western influence on Asian countries. His first work was King Rat, which was semi-autobiographical of his time as a POW of the Japanese during World War II. Afterward, he wrote Taipan, or Taipan, which takes place during Europe's acquisition of Hong Kong after the First Opium Wars. These were both great novels, but it wouldn't be until his third, Shogun, that really took the world by storm. At this time, people outside of Japan didn't really know a lot about Japanese history. It wasn't exactly a common topic. But this novel, this delicately crafted story, invaded the minds of readers. It truly put you into this world with painstaking attention of detail and historical accuracy. Well, not all of it was entirely correct. Although given the time that it was written and the acceptance of creative liberties given that it is a historical fiction, it's still pretty damn impressive. Most of the inaccuracies are little details. Some historians will write off the story as being far too romantic, but others will praise it. It is a historical fiction, a fictionalized retelling of true events. It does not claim to be a one-on-one accurate depiction, although it does give you a pretty general and honest idea of what really happened. And it brought about a new interest of feudal Japan to non-Japanese readers, and without a doubt played a major role in building an original generation of weebs. The novel is inspired by William Adams, the first English explorer to reach Japan. Fans of the game Neo may be familiar with this name. He was a pilot-navigator, a part of the 5-ship expedition set out to find the mystical Japans in 1598. Accompanying the expedition was the Dutch, who, like England, were Protestant and fighting against Catholic Spain and Portugal in the 80 Years' War, which was for the independence of Dutch from Spain. Adams was on the last surviving ship, after a treacherous voyage, one that cost him the life of his brother. After 19 months at sea, with a crew of less than 30 men, dying of scurvy and whatever other god-cursed diseases they had, after a typhoon swept away the second-to-last ship, Adams anchored his ship at Kyushu, Japan. Only 9 of the crew would survive to see the mainland. Much to Adams' surprise, he was welcomed by Jesuit Portuguese who had reached Japan in the mid-1500s. Being that their countries were enemies, the Jesuits told the Japanese that Adams was a pirate. Adams was imprisoned, and his ship with all its weapons were confiscated by the daimyo of Edo, which will be Tokyo in the future, Tokugawa Ieyasu. The story is retold in a fictionalized manner in Clavell's novel, offering a more cinematic experience to the story than what it actually was, not to dilute the significance of the original adventure. The novel changes characters' names and events, but you still learn a lot of actual Japanese history and even the language. William Adams is now John Blackthorne, still a pilot and still leading a single ship, the Erasmus, of cursed souls to the mystical unknown land known as Japan. A storm overtakes the Erasmus and brings the crew to a fishing village in Japan, Anjiro. While the next bit may be shortened in the history lesson, it is the beginning of the story for Blackthorne. The novel is a behemoth, but none of it is fluff. You get to learn everything about the world, the time, the characters. You know their thoughts, their motivations, their deceit for others, and their trials. We get a more omniscient view and understanding than Blackthorne. Occasionally, we still learn with him, but we also learn more than he does. With how well the novel had sold and was received, it was no surprise that it would be adapted. Of course, the length of the novel made concerns for how it could be tackled. But in 1977, something unique happened that changed the face of television. A miniseries called Roots aired. It goes without saying that this was one of the most successful ventures of television history, not just on the topic of how important the material was, but how it brought to attention a new style of television programming, the miniseries. It proved to be the best way to adapt Shogun, a story too short for TV and too large for film. A 9-hour series was ordered. The scriptwriter suggested to Clavell to have the series told primarily from Blackthorn's perspective. As the series was an American production intended mainly for Western audiences, they wanted the audience to learn with Blackthorn. Clavell agreed and brought him a paperback copy of Shogun containing only the scenes from Blackthorn's perspective and anything else that was absolutely necessary for the narrative. What was truly groundbreaking about this series was that it was shot on location in Japan. It is the largest US-Japanese television co-production. To really sell this series, they needed a strong star for the lead. Much of the cast would be played by phenomenal Japanese actors, both incredibly talented and legendary. But this wouldn't be enough to sell to 1970s, 1980s American audiences. Sean Connery was the original idea for Blackthorn, and while he was interested in the project, he didn't work for television. In the end, we got American actor Richard Chamberlain, one of the old school type of actors with a real knack for making their presence known. He may not be British, but he definitely owned the role. Besides not being blonde, he really did capture the novel's lead. He had leadership qualities about him, a command in his voice when he spoke.
You get your face lost until you're dead. You make last call.
The Tokugawa character, Toranaga, would be played by Toshiro Mifune. Like there was any doubt. The most famous Japanese actor of all time. One of the most respected actors to have ever been put on the screen. Need I even say more? It's literally Mifune. The leading lady was a bit more complicated. For a truly authentic experience, they wanted a Japanese actress to portray Mariko. It was difficult at the time to find an actress who fit the bill and spoke English enough for the role. They were already deep into filming and still had not found an actress. CBS was so desperate they were actually willing to put a white actress into the role, to which the filmmakers were disgusted at the idea. Rightfully so. Eventually, they found Yoko Shimada, who without a doubt brought the character to life. The perfect casting, if only her character wasn't so shredded in the script. I also can't forget to acknowledge the man himself.
Good, I'm Vasco Rodriguez, pilot of this galley, at least on this miserable trip.
He was portrayed by a Welsh actor, John Rhys Davies, Gimli, among other works such as Indiana Jones and SpongeBob. Davies is without a doubt one of the greatest actors of all time. It's because of Shogun that his career truly landed, and he thanks the series to this day for it.
I think it's actually a masterpiece, to be honest with you. And a great and complex work, and an extraordinary recension of a wonderful period of Japanese history.
Just listen to that laugh. That is how you make a memorable character. One that sticks with you and makes you excited when you revisit the series. Another interesting cast was Frankie Sakai as Yabu. He was a famous comedian who is probably well remembered for his role in Mothra. This role was definitely different from what he was accustomed to. Many have criticized this casting, and I kinda understand why. He definitely doesn't have the vile, sadistic demeanor of Yabu, although he interestingly brought a comedic evil to the character. He comes off more as someone with a dark sense of humor and treating life as such. He was still very much a snake who cared for his own personal gain. He had no true loyalties, except to the winning side. Aside from the phenomenal cast, what truly brought the series to life was the on-location shooting. It was quite difficult, though, to manage an entire crew in the late 70s in a foreign country that had quite outdated equipment. The director of photography remarked how fascinated he was to see the equipment that was practically ancient at the time. Primitive was the word that was used when describing the filming conditions. Learning to mesh together the different styles of filmmaking was hard, but it brought a true level of authenticity. One of the major hurdles the American crew had to learn was set building.
We couldn't come in and say, okay, now put cement down on the floors and all of that. Japanese built their sets up from the dirt floors. They built a stage, and then they built the set on that stage.
I never saw anybody build a roof and have 4 guys hold it up and build a house under it before, but it looked great when they got finished, you know.
The director even remarked that he noticed the sets were bound by cord instead of nailed together, which is quite hard to fathom. The Japanese were fixated on building everything in a traditional manner that's existed in cinema for decades. They rightfully believed in if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And I think the final result speaks for itself. They're so well made you could practically live in them. One of the earliest locations was in Nagashima for the fishing village in Jiro. It was originally a rather untouched area full of trees that had to have been cut down so they could build the village. And when filming was finished, they of course replanted the trees before leaving. Reportedly, a typhoon actually came in the day after they finished filming and took the whole set with it. Talk about lucky timing. Even more ironic is that in the book, a typhoon does tear down much of the housing in the village, although that scene was omitted in the series. A lot of the scenes at sea were filmed in Toho's famous pool, the one that any Godzilla fan would recognize. Though the Americans learned just how difficult filming in this pool actually was. The pool was actually located in a neighborhood which would be victim to water loss when filling it up. Not to mention they would get noise complaints if the filming went on too late or too loud. Filming the storm scene, for example, had a multitude of machines running for all the effects. They all had to be done in camera. Luckily, Jimmy Carter was in town in Japan, and this required the entire police force's attention. So, if someone in the neighborhood wanted to call in a complaint, nobody would be available to answer. The film crew got lucky yet again. On the topic of the sea, the Erasmus was a true piece of art. No CGI boats here. It was built to scale and actually sailed from London to San Francisco, then to Japan. They actually sailed the boat. It had a motor built into it, but the captain wanted a real authentic experience. Notice how the term authentic keeps popping up? Yeah, that's what makes this series so effective. A lot of that goes to the art direction, which was impeccable. Take for example the wardrobe, all handcrafted as they would have been at the time. I mentioned before that there were historical inaccuracies. One of those, which was somewhat intentional for the narrative, was the samurai's color design. They did not have militant colors back then. Although for the narrative, it's a simple visual directive for the viewer to know who's on the good side and who's on the bad side. In the novel, this is how Blackthorn is able to deduce the different factions and how they hold disdain for one another. It works the same for a viewer watching the program. Realistically, samurai would actually hold flags in their armor to let the battlefield know their role. The production for Shogun was a true nightmare and seemed an impossible task. It was one of the most daunting and ambitious productions of the time, and it mostly survived thanks to luck. But now, over 30 years later, with a new series on the way, we wonder, how well does it hold up? How well does it fare as an adaptation? Well, let's take a look. I've heard the story. I've heard it countless times. I am aware that you can see the helicopter shadow in the opening. Imperfections are to be expected with cinema. It does not mean that this was not made with hard work. The truth is, this was one of the most difficult scenes to film. A TV production in the late 70s wanted an aerial shot of the Erasmus at sea during a time when filming in a helicopter was a true nightmare. Damn near impossible with the wind blowing the camera around that had to be shot handheld. That said, I don't really like the opening myself. Not that it is a means for people to just give up after seeing that first flub. I wish that the story had just started at the storm like the book had. It's eventful, exciting, and it throws you right into the harshness of this world. I understand that they needed to get an opening narration by Orson Welles so that the average viewer could have some understanding of what's going on in 1600. There is something whimsical about it. It's corny, but it still has that sense of adventure. I'm also not very fond of the opening sequence. The opening highlights both the best and the worst of the soundtrack. The soundtrack for Shogun has some truly beautiful, beautiful tracks, such as the love theme. I already discussed early on the difficulties of filming the storm scene. It paid off pretty well though. Although I wish they had included the moment when Blackthorn visits his personal cabin. It would have been a beneficial scene to tell the viewers why he's the only crew member who doesn't have scurvy. In the novel, he takes out a piece of an apple he's been feeding on for weeks, mocking the other crews for neglecting the fruit, and that's why they're all sick. It could still be a silent scene that pressed the point forward. Once we reach Japan, we're welcomed by the first masterfully crafted set. Everything about this is perfect. Just look at the dishes and the trays, the mats on the floor, the paper doors. Look at the angle the light is coming down at. This is incredible. There's such a vibrancy and tangibility into these shots. It could almost feel documentary at times. And I'll get into a very specific example when we get to part 3. I could go on for hours in this video appreciating the attention to details or fawning over the tracking shot that reveals more of the set as we follow Blackthorn. There's a bit here when Blackthorn asks the servant what her name is. In her misunderstanding, she teaches him the word Ona, which means woman. He believes this is her name. There's a scene later in the novel where he returns at night screaming for Ona because he's hungry, confused, and tired. To the Japanese, he's just going around screaming for a woman in the house. Mura explains that Ona means woman, and Blackthorn is yet again embarrassed. Since there's no real follow-up to this, I'm not entirely sure why they kept this moment. It doesn't really circle back to anything. We get our first encounter with the Portuguese Jesuit. The Portuguese first arrived in Japan in 1543. This was during the Sengoku period, and thus the Portuguese served a role in selling the Japanese guns. Oda Nobunaga famously used these guns in one of the most impactful battles of Japanese history, the Battle of Nagashino. The Jesuits sent out missionaries to bring Catholicism to Japan at the time, and it had some influence. However, there were also slave trades going on. The Portuguese were taking Japanese citizens, especially women, as slaves. Nobunaga's successor, Hideyoshi Toyotomi, the most important person in Japan at the time, was understandably revolted at the excessive slavery going on, and thus put a ban on Catholicism, as well as slave trade in Japan. This was around 20 years before Adams or Blackthorn would arrive. Although Hideyoshi had made these demands, the Jesuits were still around, but tensions were pretty high. It goes without saying that Japan was a difficult country to convert. Things like murder, adultery, and homosexuality were not only accepted, but commonplace. That's definitely enough to make a 16th century priest blush. One of the big things the Jesuits in Japan did at the time was wear orange robes. Not only is this a point in the novel, but it's also what happened in history. Mind you, this was early in the missionaries' missions, and was later a revoked practice. The reason they wore orange was because it was the color of holy men in Japan, Buddhist monks. That, and the Japanese weren't very fond of the color black in clothing. So Blackthorn meets his first Jesuit, which is also his enemy. The Catholic Portuguese were of course enemies with the rest of Protestant Europe. Blackthorn is naturally confused and frightened when he sees Christianity has already reached Japan. His enemies have been here, and long enough to make an impression. The situation has gotten a lot more complicated. And we see the first on-screen TV decapitation. Unfortunately, it means it was chopped up a bit for censorship. The original cut was bloodier and more graphic, although we're lucky it aired at all. Apparently the censors didn't really read the script much and just let them film anything they wanted, which did result in some things being cut out. The scene's also a bit more censored from the books, as Omi did not just stop at cutting the head off, he also chopped the man to pieces, laughing. Shogun did quite a bit of firsts for TV, as I'll break down along the way. The series presses through more scenes from the book rather faithfully. From the crew's interview with Yabu to the pit, although we do lose something important to the story. the Japanese perspective. As before mentioned, the series wanted to focus on Blackthorn's perspective, leaving out the Japanese political side. This makes certain things difficult to understand. For instance, when Peritune is boiled alive, Yabu just stands outside making a kind of smirky face. We miss out on the genuine enjoyment he gets from listening to the suffering. There's an entire dialogue with Yabu and his family as the screaming can be heard all night long, disturbing most of the villagers. Yabu basically gets off on it. I don't really think that translated well on screen. I'd also like to give a shout out to Johann Vick, who is an actual historical figure. He was Adam's right-hand man, who also was granted samurai status. But he doesn't really have a lot to do in the story here. Now we get to the pissing scene. Blackthorn says, "I piss on your country." Omi-san says it's bad manners to piss on someone, then proceeds to piss on Blackthorn, which was actually beer. Blackthorn knows he has to be humbled a bit if he wants to keep his head. It's all part of the training for Blackthorn to be a pet. Blackthorn is not a white savior. Do not confuse him with Tom Cruise's character in The Last Samurai. This is not that story. Blackthorn is a prisoner and will remain a prisoner for the rest of his life. Back to the pissing. This was also a first for TV, both in the use of the word piss and the actual pissing. Definitely not something that was seen on TV before. We continue pretty faithfully with the story, learning a bit of Japanese here. Blackthorn is also dubbed as Anjin, which means pilot, by Omi, as the Japanese have difficulty pronouncing his name. This happened in real life too. We also see Toda Hiramatsu, based off a real samurai general who quite literally was ancient enough to have worked alongside several famous historical figures. And then we get to the man himself. My god, does Davies bring this character to life. I genuinely don't envy anyone who wants to take the mantle of this character. If they can't match this energy, it's over. There's a reason the man's career started at this series. The exchanges with Blackthorn and Rodriguez are some of my favorite, some of the most memorable moments in the entire series. Rodriguez holds tremendous power over Blackthorn, and Blackthorn never falters. Just look at his body language. He always tries to keep himself on the same level, not trying to back down.
You came for your rutters, now you want me to get out of here so that you can get them.
You're right, that's why I wanted to come. But they were in here.
We learn that Toranaga has taken the ship's spoils and weaponry, which will later be used in the most famous and most decisive battle of Japanese history.
We get more difficult sea scenes, and a surprisingly impressive take on the storm to Osaka. Rodriguez gets knocked off and Blackthorn and Yabu save each other. The scene is a bit more graphic in the novel. Rodriguez's bone is sticking out of his leg, for example. Back in Yabu's village, we get an update on Blackthorn's crew. As promised, Omi allows them back to the service to receive better treatment. During an attempted escape, a samurai loses a fight with Blackthorn and has since stayed down with the crew. Omi allows him the chance to have any shred of honor by committing seppuku. This, of course, was another first for TV, an on-screen seppuku, even though it is very, very censored. Rodriguez gives Blackthorn a bit of a history update to prepare him for the visit with Toranaga. They mix real historical events with changed names. The before-mentioned Hideyoshi was nearing death and called a council of the 5 prominent figures of Japan to be responsible for ruling Japan under his son. After Hideyoshi's death, Tokugawa wanted to be shogun. Tokugawa led an assault and takeover of Osaka Castle, offending the other leaders and pushing to another civil war. His biggest opposition was Ishida Mitsunari. In Shogun, this character is Ishido, a one-letter difference. This made a major split in Japanese forces, Tokugawa the east and Ishido the west. To put it simply, both powerhouses were fighting for the title of shogun and to have control over Japan. But simply crossing swords wasn't an option. It had to be far more tactful. And then Adams washed up to shore and got caught in the middle. The show gives us an early introduction of the 2 leading Catholic forces in Japan. Father Alvido, based off the real Jesuit interpreter and priest who was quite the linguist in Japan and China. He was the main interpreter for Alessandro Valignano, the overseer of Jesuit missions in Japan. The Jesuits are frightened by Blackthorn's appearance as he can jeopardize what they have tactfully chosen to tell the Japanese about the outside world. Blackthorn finally meets Toranaga and what can I say? Mifune is Mifune. His presence is kingly. He demands your attention in the room. His presence lets you know that he is the guy. He's the real powerhouse. He is one of the most famous, if not the most famous figure of Japan. In the novel, these scenes are much longer. Blackthorn informs Toranaga of the war on the outside world and his desire for trade, with Toranaga having to keep beating manners into him. The TV adaptation changes some things around, including introducing Mariko much earlier than initially. And it doesn't really do anything either. She's just kind of there for Blackthorn to thirst over. Ishido interrupts the meeting and Toranaga has Blackthorn imprisoned for his safety. A pretty important scene is cut out as Blackthorn leaves. Since this is just from his perspective, we don't see this scene. Toranaga and Ishido talk for a bit, and Ishido makes some pretty obvious insults to Toranaga. Hiramatsu's grandson is infuriated at his master's insult and prepares to strike down Ishido. Realizing his mistake, he stops and pleads Toranaga for forgiveness. Toranaga is forced to sentence the man to death, and his newborn child. And he's not even allowed to walk to his death, but crawl to it. The other samurai take pride in the man's conviction as he happily agrees. They believe he will be reborn as an even greater samurai. Hiramatsu's granddaughter wishes to commit seppuku, learning that her husband and son must die, but Toranaga denies this, having plans for her later. Blackthorn picks up some Japanese in prison, and even more important, learns of the Jesuit trade schemes and famous black ship that rakes in over $1 million in gold a year. No major changes here, except everyone is wearing underwear, and the fact that Blackthorn straight up beats a guy to death over a bowl of gruel. It's after Blackthorn is called out of prison that we lose something. Ishido's men should have taken Blackthorn out, only to be attacked by Yabu and some of Toranaga's men dressed up as bandits. There's also some bits of flashback from Blackthorn's past, which frankly isn't that important for the narrative. The bandit scene does add a little bit more of the political drama between Ishido and Toranaga, but since this is focused from Blackthorn's perspective, we lose that. This is also where Mariko should have made her first appearance. Prior to meeting with Blackthorn, we should see Mariko speaking with Kiri and learning some of her past and backstory. Most of which the series will explain later, although her character is still severely diluted. I should take this moment to discuss Mariko. Akechi Tama, also known as Hosokawa Garcia. She was the last survivor of the clan that caused the death of Oda Nobunaga. Doing so made her the daughter of a traitor who killed his lord. Although she too was in the middle of the Ishida and Tokugawa drama, she bears similarities to Garcia, but the real-life counterparts had very little to do with one another. Interestingly enough, Yoko Shimada portrayed Garcia in a Japanese drama years prior to playing the counterpart in Shogun. Toranaga's interviews of Blackthorn are heavily condensed. Toranaga wants to learn everything about the outside world. He wants to know about England, its history, politics, hierarchy, but furthermore wants to know more about the world from a different source than the Portuguese. Here Toranaga learns that the Portuguese consider Japan to be their owned land, sparking more distrust. Quite a bit of political context is also taken away here as we lose a conversation between Toranaga and Yodo. We do get some extra context on the Jesuit side though. This is still heavily condensed, but we get a better understanding of the pressure put on the Jesuits. Some errors here include Del Aqua not wearing orange. He's also not the tallest person in the room, as he's vividly described. We also see Captain General Ferreira for the first time, who is the Captain General of the Black Ship, based loosely off of Horatio Neretti. The assassin scene starts pretty spot on. I wish they would have kept the part of Kiri pulling out a dagger ready to fight though. The main change here is at the end. When the assassin kills himself, Naga proceeds to cut off his head, rip off the mask, ask if anyone recognizes him. Mind you, Naga has just got out of bed and is basically in his underwear. No one does, so he spits in his face, throws the head at one of his men, then proceeds to behead the guard in charge of the watch. Toranaga later punishes Naga and all of the guards that night, as they have brought shame to themselves by letting the assassin get so close. Toranaga also pieces that Yabu had a hand in this, being that he's the only one who would know how to get a hold of the assassins, and thus interrogates his knowledge under the guise of watching a sunset. It's an entire mental game of cat and mouse, switching between perspectives, as we know each party is suspicious of the other and aware of their actions. And the two also share a piss together off a cliff. Blackthorn gets his first bit of R&R since arriving in Japan, and we get this.
Fare thee well, O you Barbary merchants. Fare thee well to the Spanish blockade. Fare thee well to the Straits of Gibraltar.
I swear to God, if this isn't in the remake, I'll throw the biggest tantrum known to man. This may actually be my favorite moment in the entire story. It's even cuter in the book, when the girls also try to imitate the dance, but all tumble from the length of their kimonos. Blackthorn is rewarded with Toranaga's kimono for sharing his dance with him. While it may be a great honor, one can't ignore the fact that it's also part of Blackthorn donning Toranaga's colors, a step forward to his branding and assimilation. We also get the famous "What's your type" scene, in which Mariko tries to get Blackthorn laid. He gets offended when she offers him a boy, something that was not very uncommon there. In the book, a samurai even suggests if he is impotent, leading to another one of my favorite moments in the novel. Poor Mariko is unaware of how uptight and embarrassed Westerners are of such topics. We also get added context that Blackthorn's offense to the remark of sodomy was due to the fact that as a young boy at sea, he was almost raped. That was also when he committed his first murder. We also get some insight into the misogyny of feudal Japan, which the show seemed not to want to press too hard on. Mariko expresses sentiments such as women do not have the knowledge or wisdom, or men don't apologize to ladies, whatever they do is correct. I think this is significant in showing Mariko's fight. She's obviously an incredibly strong and intelligent character, tragically living in a man's world. We see just how worse it gets for her later on, but it's important to have these opening steps. Mariko also shows her cleverness by saving the life of one of the servant girls, who asked about sex in the first place, by convincing the guard that if she had not asked it now, it could have been asked later by Kiri or Toranaga, and blood would have flowed. Mariko may be one of the most underappreciated characters in all of literature. It was cute of them to show us Alvido and Mifune speaking Japanese together, but it gives us almost nothing of importance compared to the scene in the novel. But it'll pretty much flesh out at the Black Ship later. I really enjoy the dynamic between Blackthorn and Alvido. We may not be in their minds like in the novel, but the actors do well enough to show us the hatred they have for one another, even as they hold face during their conversations. Just look at their body language, not to mention this incredible shot. Osaka Castle stands behind and above them, dominating their lives and dominating the shot. But even better, towards the end we get this blessing of a shot. What purpose does it have? None. Do we need it? No. Is it incredible? Yes. Yes, it is. We also finally meet Buntaro, Mariko's husband. That is just a face that you want to hit. Perfectly casted. He's described as being short, necklace, and looking like a troll. The adaptation chose to take a more comedic approach with Blackthorn's faking of insanity. In the show, he's bouncing around, Chamberlain borderline having a heat stroke, bellowing his heart out. In the novel, he actually chokes Ishido for a bit, and every samurai is ready to kill him. They made this scene truly exciting though. We have the tension of Ishido following them with an arrow. Mariko does great to keep up with Blackthorn's tempo and his excellent tracking shots. The camera does jerk at places, but it adds to the effect of Blackthorn's craziness in the scene. But the music is definitely killing the mood here. It's far too dominating. The story progresses and Blackthorn gets more condensed lessons in Japanese culture and Mariko. The scene downplays her character building, but it gets even worse when the assault happens. I'm not sure if it was censorship or time, but this entire escape sequence got chopped to hell. During the Reign of Arrows, one of the maids that's been with Blackthorn for his entirety at Osaka Castle is shot and killed. They aren't even present in the scene at all. Another drowns during the ship's escape, both of which traumatize Blackthorn. His rage fueling even more with Toranaga's crew laughing and cheering as they sail away from at least 300 bodies. The fight scenes are also pretty bad. A blockade of Ishido's men forced Toranaga to board the Black Ship, making a deal with the Jesuits and Captain General who want Blackthorn. We also see an instance of racist remarks the Portuguese use on the Japanese. In the novel, this horrifies Mariko, being a Christian and still in doubt whether the Portuguese are Japan's enemy or not. The scene is actually more horrific in the novel. Mariko and a samurai attempt to wake up Blackthorn from his food-drunk stupor, only to be berated and thirsted by an absolutely disgusting pig of a bosun. He both racially and sexually demeans Mariko. Blackthorn wakes up and the rest of the scene plays the same. The escape from the blockade was one of the most problematic nights of the entire production. I shall reiterate that filming night scenes on water is incredibly difficult. Lighting is hard to maintain on unstable objects such as a boat at sea. Not only that, but once everything finally lines up, you have a limited window to get the shot. The crew of Japanese soldiers and muskets here had one job. When they heard the phrase "now," shoot.
You gonna tell me when to say now?
Okay. No, don't fire!
No.
Yeah, that can be a pretty hard thing to recover from. But perseverance pays, and we got a pretty cool sequence in the end result. Another sequence is skipped from the novel is when all the samurai go skinny dipping on the way back to Anjiro. We missed out on naked Mifune. What a damn shame. Blackthorn is stationed at Anjiro so that he can learn Japanese language and culture. Toranaga grants Blackthorn a status of Hanamoto, a high-ranking samurai personal vassal of Toranaga, mainly as protection for him while he returns to Yedo. The series has significantly reduced all the political plot lines going on the sides right now as Blackthorn studies, including removing the visit of one of Ishido's generals who Omi and Yabu kill, and Naga, Toranaga's son, trying to befriend and learn from Blackthorn. Blackthorn is also assimilating quite intently into Japanese culture, even attempted seppuku after Yabu promised to kill the villagers if Blackthorn does not master the language in 6 months. This act pushed Yabu to rescind the decree, although he does not truly intend to do so. Let us again take a moment to appreciate the fine craftsmanship of this set. Even the little detail of the rain falling outside. The timing and tension of the scene is also done quite well. It's moments like these that stick in the audience's mind long after they've viewed the series. Omi is playing a much larger role now in the story, trying to befriend Blackthorn and overthrow Yabu. Blackthorn still despises Omi for pissing on him, but his mind slowly begins to forgive the act. Karma, nah? Blackthorn has learned a decent amount of Japanese by this point, although in the show he's still limited to a few words. Blackthorn continues his community college Japanese lessons while taking every free moment to flirt with Mariko, and to bathe with her. Apparently quite a bit of frontal nudity was filmed, and also available on the movie cut. After a night of drinking, a mysterious figure sleeps with Blackthorn. He automatically assumes that it was Mariko, who states that it was a maid that she set up for him, as married women are not allowed to sleep with another man. Was it a maid? Or was it really Mariko? Mariko. It was Mariko. They did quite excellently hiding her face with a shadow. Just enough light illuminated to make out that it is her. Keep in mind that the TVs used at the time when this aired probably made it much more difficult to actually decipher the shot. Tensions get worse when Buntaro shows up for a visit. After Blackthorn mocks and taunts him in a game of drink, Buntaro decides to show off his abilities with the bow. He fires an impossible shot several times at lightning speed. Lightning speed. Unfortunately, he actually does shoot the arrows right next to Mariko's face. They obviously couldn't do that in the original, and then it just kind of looks goofy in the remake. Later in the night, Buntaro beats up Mariko. Mariko has a phenomenal scene here, and the show almost does it perfectly. Yoko Shimada's performance is almost tear-jerking. I sincerely think this is the best performance in the entire series.
Tonight it's my fault. If I would weep as he wants, beg forgiveness as he wants, spread myself in pretended fear as he wants, then he would be like a child in my hand.
Most of this is straight out of the source material, but they left out several key moments of the dialogue related to Mariko's backstory coming full circle. She uncharacteristically opens up to Blackthorn, no longer wearing her usual docile face. We've seen moments of her being able to be herself with Blackthorn that she can't really be in Japanese society. The strong female character that she really is shines in this scene, and we don't really get that here. They made her look beaten, but forgot to show us the true strength that she presented in this scene. Blackthorn is growing attached to his consort, Fujiko. Fujiko was the wife of Hiramatsu's grandson who was put to death earlier in the novel. She has done nothing but beg for suicide the entire story, which Toranaga has denied. But as she continues to live with Blackthorn, her desire for death fleets. Since Japan was primarily vegan, not all of it, the idea of killing and eating game was quite revolting to the Japanese. However, Blackthorn, being the burly westerner that he is, needs to eat his damn meat. He teaches the chefs how to cook, and there's some pretty grotesque moments. the most important being the pheasant incident. He hangs up a pheasant as it
matures the meat.
instructing that no one touch. Well, they took it literally. A gardener, as lower class didn't have names, were only known by what they did, breaks the rule by putting the meat down due to it rotting. This earned him a swift death. Blackthorn was rather fond of the old man too, and it breaks him pretty bad.
You murdering bitch!
Blackthorn weeps because the gardener's death is on his hands, by his set rule. After everything he's been through, Blackthorn finally cries. This is a time where people were built different and much harder. So seeing him actually cry is probably more impactful than you actually think. Damn, he plays this well. He plays this like someone who's actually broken, someone who does not cry very often in their life and has finally been pushed to that point. He doesn't over-exaggerate, but rather plays it convincingly. He then shares a tender moment with Fujiko, who now seems quite happy to live, and is no longer so desperate to kill herself. Toranaga has quite a bit of scenes going on, but the show doesn't care, so we skip to the earthquake. I can imagine the CGI nightmare this will be in the remake, but it might be fair. The original was a nightmare, and it almost killed people too. The shot was made using little trap doors hidden under the earth with charges set in them to explode. Unfortunately, it rained before shooting, which hardened the earth that was set. When the crew went to replace the charges, a support beam fell and buried some of the crew underneath. Thankfully, no one died, but it was a truly horrifying moment, and much of the Japanese side of the crew came to think that the set was cursed with bad luck. I'm the type of person who will complain about CG, but I'll also gladly take a mediocre shot over losing the life of a human being. Blackthorn saves Toranaga from the earthquake and is rewarded with the status of samurai. And a night in the town with the most famous geisha, Kiku. All in all, pretty accurate scene here. They did leave out the dildos though. I'm not joking. Kiku and Mariko introduced Blackthorn to some of the world's earliest sex toys, a concept entirely uncommon to him. Kiku even makes Blackthorn wear a ring, if you will, on his person while they diddle. This is definitely one of the best looking sets in the series. The details on the walls is unmatched. The hand-built nature of these sets just add to the authenticity. The next chunk of the story is heavily condensed as Toranaga is preparing for war with Ishido. A lot of political stuff is skimmed and quite a bit of time with Blackthorn and Omi is omitted. But we do see the tea ceremony, which was done quite beautifully. They kinda ruin it with this generic "you are my villain" Anjin-san scene. But that aside, the rest of this is pretty damn good. And then we get to my boy Joseph. If you didn't have much reason to dislike Alvido up to this point, you should by now. Joseph Uraga had a fun night with a prostitute, and the Jesuits don't take kindly to that. In the book, he actually had a couple fun times. Alvido orders him to be lashed, in which Joseph is appalled. Being a samurai, he is not allowed the shame of being whipped, thus renounces his faith. There's a bit left out here also where he asks a pretty good question to Alvido. Why won't you ordain any Japanese Catholics? Many of them have been Christian since childhood, and who have lived without sin. Alvido does not express it deliberately, but he does not believe that they should be ordained as they cannot speak Latin and would find missionary work difficult. Relatively plausible response. He's still an asshole though. Oh, and Mariko and Blackthorn are having sex now. Mariko and Blackthorn continue their secret affair, which isn't so secret as literally anyone with eyes can tell what's going on, and they are sleeping together a lot. They spend much of these scenes speaking Latin to one another, and there isn't really any indication of this within the series context, which is something that definitely could be improved on, as to understand why they suddenly just started speaking Shakespearean out of nowhere. It's because they're speaking Latin. Normally they're speaking Portuguese together, but here it's Latin. The story lingers on a bit, even with Kiku and her master being part of the caravan to Mishima. They don't have much to do in the series though, and frankly they're getting pretty strapped for time as it is, so yeah, we'll just not have them there. We finally get to see Rodriguez again. Not much to say here as the scene is pretty accurate to the novel. Props to this shot though. Nice close-up of Alvido's beard covered in bird grease as Rodriguez gives a powerful monologue on his own doubt and internal turmoil. We get some pretty basic foreground-background play here. Alvido takes up much of the screen in the foreground while Davies is in the back. Although he's smaller, he dominates the screen with his performance. Both of these characters are being very contemplative here, but in different regards. Davies is more open and Alvido is more stoic. We also lose a scene where Rodriguez talks to his wife, whose Christian name, interestingly enough, is Gracia, the same as Hosokawa Gracia, the real-life counterpart for Mariko. After Mariko goes out for a day of shopping and buys another ring for Blackthorn, interesting to have that context in your head before seeing the scene. It's interesting that Blackthorn finally gets to see the Erasmus after this, but we don't get to see it? Seems like a pretty impactful moment that should have been included. It's also funny that Blackthorn drools over seeing his ship again, and Mariko is acutely aware that he's already more interested in the ship than her. What a sailor. Toranaga has a meeting with Blackthorn. The series extends this to 2 different meetings, as Blackthorn in this version doesn't speak Japanese as well as he does in the novel, meaning that he needs Alvido to translate for him. I don't like this very much as it affects the pacing, and I prefer the direct interactions with Blackthorn and Toranaga. Toranaga quickly picks up on Blackthorn's level of Japanese and puts himself on the same level. They communicate quite well. He's surprisingly more patient with Blackthorn than any of the other characters. He also doesn't get mad when Blackthorn asks for Mariko to be divorced so that he can marry her like he does in the series. He basically tells Blackthorn to wait and see, not to say anything. After 5 hours into the series, Blackthorn finally reunites with his crew. They actually picked up quite a bit of Japanese in the novel, enough to get by with. Outside of that, this is pretty accurate. Is this Lord of the Rings? This scene also happened in the book, although Blackthorn wasn't present. They needed him there for obvious reasons. Fujiko returns and in the novel actually has sex with Blackthorn, who described it as being satisfactory. What a great guy he is. And then he has an aggressive quickie with Mariko the moment Fujiko steps out the room. Outside of that, the rest of the story up to Osaka is pretty accurate. Just shortened scenes, really. They did omit a moment where Yabu kills a Ronin who calls him an asshole, and borrows Blackthorn's sword to do so. Doesn't really affect the narrative much, but it is a rather violent scene that was omitted. Not much to say for the rest up until Osaka Castle. That's where things get heavily condensed. The series has about an hour and a half left with over 300 pages of material to cover. So they essentially removed an entire plot with Kiyama, a Christian daimyo who was against Blackthorn being there. He's also responsible for Mariko's son. Oh yeah, Mariko's son actually makes an appearance in the novel. This whole plotline results in a big samurai fight and an attempt to leave with Kiri and Sasuko, who just had Toranaga's child, by the way. The end result being Mariko proposing to commit seppuku for failing her orders to her master. All of this is replaced with a dialogue exchange within the same scene as Ochiba's birthday, which is also one of Mariko's best moments in the entire book. And we have no idea what she's saying, unless you already understand Japanese or read the book. Yes, I realize this is supposed to be from Blackthorn's perspective, but this is such a good scene that we're missing from Mariko. Some of her best lines of dialogue are here. And just like with Toranaga, Blackthorn communicates with baby talk to Ishido and Ochiba, who are both pretty fascinated with his desire to learn. Blackthorn even apologizes for the whole escape incident, which Ishido accepts. Obviously the two hate each other, but it's a pretty interesting exchange. One that would almost convince you that they feel otherwise. There's a bit of backstory with Ochiba and Toranaga that's cut out. It actually is pretty important for context, but not so much with this adaptation. The attention to detail is uncanny with Mariko's seppuku ceremony. From the details of her movements to the scenery, to her outfit. Seriously, just look at this. Mariko perfectly centered with the castle looming above her, her honor and her duty to her master and nation watching over her. The white reflects brilliantly and steals your attention effortlessly. In the adaptation, there is absolutely no dialogue here, and it makes it so much more intense. The tension and suspense are at its pinnacle here. Yoko does well in her body language to show how her conviction wavers. She is perfectly still without any regret in her action, until Ishido gives her another chance at life. You can see her shaking now, the strength having left her body. I always wondered about the part with Blackthorn carrying her though. Is that allowed? Can he do that? Well, he just did. Oh hey, there's Kiku. The show neglects to mention that she's pregnant. The father could either be Blackthorn, Omi, or Toranaga. The idea of 3 possible men being the father may have been taboo for TV at the time, but I actually don't think that was the factor. They were probably just strapped for time and had to admit it. The ninjas invading the castle was actually a lot more intricate in the book, but here Yabu kind of just lets them in. It's cool that they let Blackthorn have this little action moment here, but it'd be even better if he was shooting his gun off like the book. Him fighting ninjas hand to hand just doesn't sit right. Also, this guy. What the hell was that about? Mariko's death is pretty faithful, even down to the timing and the tension. The explosion, though, doesn't look great. Realistically, her body should have been mutilated, though her face was rather undamaged. It actually circles back to Blackthorn's past when his master died in a similar fashion. A major change here is the damage done to Blackthorn. In the novel, his ears are damaged, and he's deafened for a bit. In the series, his eyes are injured, and he's blinded for a bit. It's a kind of fascinating change for the visual media to have injured his vision. In real life, Hosokawa Garcia died in a different manner. Ishida attempted to hold her as hostage. Her retainer killed her to preserve her honor, then committed seppuku after setting the castle on fire. Man, that castle always has something happening to it. Mariko's funeral may be the best scene in the entire series. I mentioned before how there were occasional documentary feels in this. This is the major one. There's a deafening lack of a score. It's incredibly mournful and almost silent. The camera moves behind Blackthorn as if it were capturing a real event. The way it moves and jitters gives a sense of realism to the cinematography. As we linger on the flames cremating Mariko, it's contemplative and harrowing. We can feel Blackthorn's despair and seeing everything that he cannot. The series presses through the rest of the book on hyperspeed, hitting the main points. Michael leading Blackthorn to Del Aqua. The killing of the Captain General and promotion of Rodriguez was actually made for the series. In the novel, the one who dies is that creepy bastard who tried to rape Mariko. No one's gonna miss that son of a bitch. Afterwards, Blackthorn learns of the death of the Erasmus. It was true in real life as well, as Adam's ship rotted and sank. 4 years after his arrival, Tokugawa would order Adams to build Western-style ships for Japan, in which he did and had a major impact on Japanese trade. You know, Vic's death never made a lot of sense to me. It seemed like a quick shot really, even in the book. His real-life counterpart drowned at sea 20 years after arriving at Japan. Here he just kind of keels over. It's not one of the best moments of the series, that's for sure. And the series ends somewhat anticlimactic. In the book, it ends right before the Battle of Sekigahara, and then gives a one-page epilogue on the after events after Toranaga's victory. Ishido dies, and Toranaga becomes shogun. That's it. What actually happened next in real life? Adams actually became Tokugawa's chief interpreter and somewhat of a good friend who had visitation rights pretty much whenever he wanted. Tokugawa had stated that Williams was dead and was now Miura Anjin, now samurai. Really, this was just a ploy to keep Adams happy and safe while he was still imprisoned in Japan. He was never allowed back home. Adams assimilated well. He even married in Japan and had 2 children. 2 officially, at least. He had major involvement in Asian trade until his death in 1620 at the age of 55. His grave is in Nagasaki, and you can still see his marker today. Well, that's Shogun in a nutshell. As far as an adaptation, it's pretty tricky. It doesn't directly offend the source material, and when it's faithful, it's exact. There's so much content cut out that it's difficult to call it perfect. But if you look at it from Blackthorn's perspective, it's pretty damn close. I still think it's one of the most beautiful narratives ever put to screen. Every damn frame is incredible. The amount of work and effort and the absolute nightmare that it was to create. It seemed an impossible epic to do in the late 70s. Now that there's a remake coming out, and I will always address it as such, there's going to be a new generation of Shogun fans, and it makes me a little nervous. Almost all of the comments in response to the trailers are about Ghost of Tsushima or The Last Samurai references. That's not Shogun. I'm not opposed to a Shogun remake. It was always my dream to make one, and I will watch and discuss this new one. I think that even with the modern series, it still doesn't match up to the same ambitious scope as the original. Making Shogun today doesn't seem nearly as impossible as it did back then. And if the new one is bad, we'll always have the original to look back to. Shogun is a major part of my life. I adore the novel and I love the series, and looking back on it, I still do.